And we're back for round two with Alec Blenis. Alec, thanks for coming on. The first time you came on was this kind of general topic of hybrid training. You've been on a ton of episodes discussing this. And I wanted to bring you back on for something more specific of abdominal training, core training, however we want to phrase it. But before we dive into it, for people that may have not listened to that first episode or who aren't familiar with you, can you just give a brief intro on yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Alec Blenis. I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I specialize in working with hybrid athletes. So anyone who wants to do a lot of cardio, run, cycle, whatever, be really good at that side of things, but also not sacrifice their gym gains and get stronger in the process. That's my specialty. I'm also very passionate about promoting movement optimism and kind of this anti-fragile message of your body is stronger than you think it is. It's more resilient than you think it is. And a big part of that is pushing people to do more direct core training where they're not so worried about, blowing out their back all the time. I think there's a lot of poor messaging in the rehab world around, what is and isn't safe to do with your back, with your core. So I'm looking forward to jumping into that today too.
Yeah, I reached out to you specifically because currently I'm going through your Thick and Quick program. I'm on, I think, the second iteration of it, or just a longer running, and it's this kind of hybrid running and resistance training. And within there, I've already noticed just how comprehensive and varied your trunk and ab training is. And then just with your other Instagram and social media and YouTube, it's just obvious, like you do a lot of ab related training and you have a really good, I think, perspective on how to load it appropriately. And I think you're just a great person to have this conversation. So I want to go a variety of ways, but I think a starting point is to just dive into some of these common camps or narratives around training abs. And I listed a few in our outline. But maybe you can start with what are the things you've commonly seen or heard of why people do train their abs and certain beliefs they have about it, and maybe why people avoid it or say that it's not necessary.
Yeah, for sure. So I find just core and ab training in general is a very polarizing topic. And I think for some reason, a lot of things that people know to be good and true with training other body parts, like if we were going to talk about, let's have a discussion on bicep training. I feel like people would have a lot more common ground of this is effective, volume, effective rep ranges, loading parameters, that kind of thing. But for some reason, when it comes to core, there's all these different camps and people approach it very, very differently. And I think, I wouldn't go as far to say that we should just train the core and train the spine like you would your biceps or any other muscle group. But I definitely lean more in that direction of it's not that special. But I do think there's some points to be made about, some things you might want to keep in mind with it. But some of the main camps that I see is one, kind of the stability, like core stability, endurance, McGill camp of just training for isometric strength, some low level transversus abdominis activation with bird dogs and dead bugs and all that kind of stuff. And that's often, kind of marketed as this cure all silver bullet for back pain. If you just have enough core stability, you're not going to have back pain. You're not going to have any problems. There's also this kind of rejection of that where people just take it to the polar opposite, the other extreme. And I don't want to say I'm firmly in this camp. I definitely lean more to this side. But I do find that sometimes people overpromise and underdeliver on the other extreme too, of if you just get your spine and rib cage moving, that's the solution to all your problems. So we can get into that one in a little bit as well. And then there's, some other camps that come up, like people who just don't think you need to train your core at all. You're already training your core with squats and deadlifts and whatever. So, abs are made in the kitchen, that kind of narrative as well, of just downplaying, the importance of training your core in general. So definitely a couple different interesting ideas that come up. I think there's definitely truth and something to be learned from all of these groups. But I, like with most things, people take a good idea and run a little bit too far with it.
Yeah, to that initial kind of camp, the McGill camp, for people that want a deeper dive into that topic, Mark Sertica and I had a prior episode 109 on the topic, and we're not going to really take a ton of time in today's talk. So if you want to dive into it, go to that episode. But I want this to be kind of a productive, meaningful, how do we move forward with ab training kind of conversation. But knowing that there are different beliefs and camps that does orient like, how people perceive training their abs and their core. And I think it's warranted to just bring up those different areas. And I was in that camp for a while of like, I'm doing a ton of compound lifting. I'm already getting enough trunk training. And then I started doing isolated ab training and realized like how deconditioned or underprepared I am for a variety of elements of training the abs and how many different angles and positions and loads they can be productively trained in. And I think this has shown up in other areas, especially in a rehab, but in a performance context as well, of like never training the calves or never training like isolating the quads. And now there's just more and more push and research and evidence to suggest like these isolated, constrained positions and training these tissues and tracking it over time is super beneficial for a lot of reasons. Let's start with maybe just like big picture. How do you generally view your own like training of abs, whether it's for yourself or for training clients? Where do you kind of even start?
Yeah, good question. So for me personally, when I think about training my abs, I think about, what are they already getting in a lot of the training that I'm currently doing with like squats and deadlifts and that kind of thing. And I think that's where they already get a lot of that sort of isometric type, or I say like pseudo isometric, because even in those movements, it's not like truly a perfect iso. There's still a little bit of movement in the spine going on, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I find that the core is definitely getting some stimulus in a wide variety of movements. If I'm doing a single arm dumbbell row, I'm training anti-rotation, right? If I'm doing like a single sided like contralateral or ipsilateral split squat, I'm training anti-lateral flexion. I'm bracing when I'm squatting and deadlifting. So I'm at least getting some degree of work across a lot of those different patterns that people often talk about as far as core stability goes. But what's often lacking in a more traditional program is just exploring some of those, deeper positions, end ranges, actually having concentric and eccentric strength across, full rotation, full side bending, full spinal flexion, all those sorts of things. Because I'm already getting some stimulus, isometrically or pseudo isometrically, I don't feel like I need a ton of volume. I'm not treating it like it's a whole new muscle group that I'm trying to hit for, 6 to 10 or 8 to 12 sets per week or anything like that, because I know I'm already getting something. So when I look at it, I think, how can I get just a couple of good sets, couple of good exposures to some of these movement patterns in the week? And I generally call it good. And I found that I've been able to progress my strength, my range of motion, really quite far with this very minimum effective dose approach. I don't think it has to take a lot. And it's also kind of where I laugh a little bit when people talk about it being dangerous and that kind of thing to load some of these positions. And like the total volume of work I'm doing with some of these things is really not crazy. Like a couple of exposures per week can really go a really long way in terms of preparing you to handle some of these positions that you might inevitably find yourself in. So that's generally my approach. When I'm working with clients, generally same kind of idea, minimum effective dose approach. The caveat I would say is, no, not everyone is ready to push the range of motion to the extreme right away on day one. So some of the crazy stuff I do with like full flexion, full extension, really deep side bends and twists, I've definitely seen people, flare things up from trying to push too deep into those things too far. So whether it's starting with isometrics, loading it heavy, and then gradually introducing range of motion over time, or starting someone with a bigger range of motion, but kind of lower effort, more mobility focused, if you will, and then progressing load over time. I find both of those options can work. I generally like to see what's more tolerable, what's more fun, what seems like just a good time to the individual in front of me. Some people like the idea of just being able to load stuff up real heavy right away. So for them, it's sort of a range of motion focused progression over time. Other people, they feel really good. Like when we start getting into some of these deep positions, they just feel good. They feel more mobile. They feel more open, and they can tolerate it right away. So for them, it's like, great, let's push the range. Let's open up, and we'll just gradually expose you to some more intensity over time. both approaches can work really well.
Yeah, none of this is going to be the case for every single client, and there are these context dependent situations. But I would say, I'm sure a lot of the individuals you're working with, it is this kind of general preparedness for a variety of things they want to do in their life. And that's the value of hybrid training. And that's what a lot of the listeners are doing. It's, just trying to have a comprehensive strength conditioning plan, and how do we integrate ab training into that? So when you're looking at maybe, a microcycle a week or within a month, there's ways that people view like, this is how I'm going to disperse my lower extremity volumes, and these are the patterns I want to hit. And same thing with upper body and this kind of basic like push, pull, vertical, horizontal accessory work. How do you just kind of like lay it out in your head, or just actual physically within a week of, these are the trunk positions or the planes of motions I want to hit? How do I disperse that?
Sure. So, first thing I'll say is that as long as you're getting the weekly volume in, you're going to get some progress. There's, strategies that I find to be a little bit more effective, but at the end of the day, as long as you're getting the work in somewhere, it's generally going to be okay. I do tend to like kind of microdosing or spreading the work throughout the week a little bit, just because if you do a lot of core work, like if you try to cram all your core work for the week into one day, if you do it at the beginning of a session, you might find that then it's just a little bit fatigued and you have a harder time like bracing, and it just fatigues you for some of your heavier lifts that come afterwards if you do too much at a time. If I rip 6 sets of core and then try to go squat, it's just kind of tired afterwards and that kind of thing. And similarly, if I try to do all of my core work at the end of a session like that, just I'm already fatigued, that I notice the quality drops pretty quick. I can really get a couple of good sets in before I notice that drop in quality. So I prefer to spread it out over a couple of sessions if I can, but if you have a standalone core session or whatever, there is definitely a lot of ways to make it work. In terms of kind of parsing up the patterns, I consider the big 3 patterns kind of for abs anyway. If we talk about like abs and obliques as the core, here, kind of flexion, so like your sit-ups, crunches, like that kind of pattern, your lateral flexion, so like side bends, that kind of thing, and then rotation. I find that there is more overlap across those patterns than people realize. Like you're not ever truly isolating 100% just your rectus abdominis. Like you're not getting that to contract in the absence of obliques. Similarly, like it's very difficult to completely isolate the obliques in the absence of the RA and the QL and whatever. So there's definitely some bleed over. I especially see a lot of overlap between rotation and lateral flexion. So generally how I break it up is I like to have a couple of good sets per week of some sort of flexion focused movement. So again, like your sit-ups and that kind of thing. And then a couple of good sets per week of some sort of rotation and or lateral flexion. I'll kind of bundle those together, at least starting out for people, and kind of see what's more accessible, what's more tolerable. And then, of course, you can potentially combine some of these patterns. And in the real world, and in a variety of sports, we often see these like coupled kind of flexion rotation or extension rotation. You can certainly introduce like combination patterns in the gym too. I generally don't start with them. I kind of like to get people proficient with some more like stable kind of just single plane. Like let's get your rotation down. Let's get your flexion down before we start doing some of these like diagonal cross patterns, just because it's a little bit more challenging from a coordination perspective. But that tends to be how I bundle it. So whether that means you have one day that you do 2 to 3 sets of a flexion movement, and then another day is 2 to 3 sets of some sort of side bend or twist, or if you bundle them together and one day you just have like one hard set of both patterns and then you do that again another day. Both of those I think can work very, very well.
Yeah, to your point earlier on of like, this doesn't need a ton of volume. One of those other camps that we didn't really touch on is people just doing hundreds or thousands of reps of like
yes.
these crunches or these other activities where it's probably just like so low load, so low stimulus, but they're doing it, such high volumes. Can you touch on maybe some of the downsides of that, and why do you think that? Why is that like have been built in, that just belief that like abs need more total volume or more repetitions?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when you look at like, workplace, like OSHA data, on like repetitive spinal flexion and that kind of thing, it doesn't really take a lot of load for like repetitive flexion and like a workplace environment to be potentially detrimental at those like really, really high volumes all day long. But we see, in like weightlifters and that kind of thing, people are able to get in some of these positions with significantly more load, and they're just fine because the volume is reasonable. So I think it's interesting, like looking at data we have on athletes versus occupational data, and then we look at how people think what's the safe way to train some of these things, and they end up doing the like let's just do thousands and thousands of reps, which is like, that to me is counter to like what we actually see is healthy and safer in the data. Actually, I think pushing heavier, pushing harder, and only having to do a couple sets actually makes more sense. I think people intuitively, they kind of get afraid of it, but I think in terms of what the data shows, I think it makes a lot more sense to think quality over quantity. But like muscle is muscle. Muscle is dumb tissue. It responds to load. If you wouldn't do 1,000 reps of a bicep curl, I don't know why you would do 1,000 reps for your rectus abdominis. In terms of actual muscle growth, there's nothing really special about it in terms of fiber composition, fiber type ratios, that kind of thing. It's not unlike most other things. The only potential argument is worrying about the spine. Essentially, are some of these like higher loads deleterious to spine health? Which again, there's mechanistic data to make an argument for that. But when you think about it in the context of a program of, okay, do we want to experience higher loads or do we want thousands and thousands of repetitions? I don't think that we can really say that either is surefire, zero risk whatsoever. And I've certainly talked to my fair share of people who they do 1,000 crunches, their back hurts afterwards. Whereas like you load them up, they do just 10 reps and call it good. They might feel perfectly fine. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it. Like each individual rep of 1,000 rep workout might feel better, but by the time you get that done and you've been doing 1,000 crunches for the last hour, I wouldn't be surprised if you don't feel too great afterwards.
Yeah, totally. And it's just so time consuming. Like there are those people, it's just like the stereotypes where they just spend so much time doing abs and so many reps but at the same time, it's like they never progress their training. It's just the same routine of like, I'm going to go in the gym and do 30 minutes of abs. And it's like, whatever they end up doing. But to that opposite point of like having lower volumes, having lower repetition range, and having more intent and more intensity. I remember watching a video that you had with Eugene Tao on some of these common, like, maybe not mistakes, but things just to like take note of. And you had mentioned like the respiratory muscles and this like perception of effort and like how hard it is. Can you just touch on like what you described there and yeah, that topic?
Yeah. So a lot of, your core muscles are, accessory respiratory muscles, and anyone who's braced for a heavy set of squats knows that, you brace for a set of 5, you're going to be pretty out of breath after that, after kind of, bracing everything down. Independent of true, cardio metabolic demand, just not being able to breathe for, X amount of time, it's going to make stuff feel hard. Like you can just stand there with a barbell on your back and brace, you're not doing any work, so to speak. But if you do a hold, if you brace for a minute and re-rack, you're going to be pretty winded. And the same can be said of a lot of core stuff. It's hard to breathe naturally. It's hard to get full inhales and exhales. It's just hard to get that tidal volume while you're doing serious core work. And that's even more true the more reps you do. So if your set of core starts taking, over a minute, you're 2 minutes into a set of core, that's a long time without being able to breathe how you would really like to breathe. And that's just going to cause your RPE is going to go up. It's going to feel hard. You're going to want to stop. It doesn't necessarily mean you've gotten any more, mechanical tension across the muscle groups you're trying to train. It just feels hard because you can't breathe, kind of thing. So when you load these things heavier and you can get the set done in less than 30 seconds, that respiratory limitation is not as big of a deal, and you're going to feel better about actually being able to push hard because you're going to get to breathe again in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I remember starting one of your programs, and it was like just the inverse like GHR GHD sit up, and it's like some of those trunk flexion crunch based activities in those more extreme ranges of motion, like they're kind of threatening in the sense that it's hard to breathe. But I remember you mentioning in the video as well of like, the perception of effort is there, but you can continue probably to still add load and it's just as hard. Like it just stays hard. It's just the respiratory muscles that feel like
Yeah.
constricted or fatigued. And I realize that a lot with a lot of these specific positions where I can continue to progress even though it feels like I'm on my cusp, but that's just this kind of like threatening respiratory spot in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that there's a little bit of a tolerance you develop to it of like when you keep going and train it more seriously, the threat level, the threat perception with some of the respiratory stuff will drop. But still, you don't want to make it any more of an issue than it needs to be by, dragging these sets out for a super long time and that kind of thing. But like you said, I encourage people, as long as you're not experiencing any pain or symptoms, just because a set feels hard, you might not be at the limit that you think you're at. Try to load up some of these core movements a little bit harder and see what happens. Because sometimes you're not nearly as close to your limit as you think you are. Your breath and that kind of thing is just kind of tricking you into thinking that it's hard.
Something I also noticed within your programming is a lot of people will kind of sometimes half-ass ab training and it'll be the end of the session. But a lot of times I've seen you program it on the front end and it would be kind of supersetted or paired with like more of a power or velocity based activity. And maybe touch on like why you do that and what your thoughts are. But personally, like I thought it was great because they're not really directly impacting each other. And it allows for you to still have the intent and the energy to focus on the ab training while still being fresh in the beginning of the session, and that not bleeding over into this excessive fatigue for these other kind of velocity and power and reactive elements you do on the front end as well.
Yeah, a lot of the things that people usually start their workout with, people want to walk in a gym and just start deadlifting or start squatting or whatever. They're kind of high arousal, like high barrier to entry activities, or to really ramp into those and train those movements at the intensity that you want. It's just going to take you some time to get there. Whether that's plenty of warm up sets or dedicated warm up routine or whatever, like it just is going to take you some amount of time to be able to get up to a top single and a back squat. You don't just like walk in and do that right away. What I find is that just not even nothing special about it as far as a warm up goes, but just doing something else that's not going to directly interfere. Whether it's training your calves or your core, or a secondary muscle that isn't part of that main movement. So like using a hamstring curl before squatting, for example, it helps facilitate that idea of a general warm up that we know is probably a good idea of just like get your body temperature up, get moving, increase that state of arousal. But it allows us to still get quality work done. So we're not just warming up, we're also training, we're eliciting a stimulus. So it's kind of like a, 2-for-1 deal where you get in, you start eliciting a stimulus pretty much right away while kind of facilitating that warm up for, the big compound that comes next. So I find it's just a more efficient way to go about setting up a training session, is to have some of those lower barrier to entry, items first, as long as it's not in excess and you're not doing 40 minutes of stuff before you got to go do your heavy lift. In that case, you're going to be fatigued. But if it's a quick 5-10 minute circuit of like a core exercise and a plyometric exercise, something like that, I find you don't have to go 10 out of 10 like crazy intensity. You can just kind of knock some of those out, feel pretty good, and then your heavy lift is going to go better. So for me, it's more of an efficiency thing than anything else. If you want to do a special warm up and whatever, and just start with your deadlifts or squats and save some of the core stuff for the end, I think you're going to be fine. I just don't think it's quite as efficient. And I found a lot of people respond really well to it. And they're like, well, I just feel great doing it this way. And I don't need as much, dedicated, supplementary warm up time as I thought.
Going back to those kind of big three positions, flexion, lateral flexion or side bending, and then rotation, you mentioned that for some individuals, like their entry point is more of this isometric component. How do you determine like when that makes sense for someone? Is that just based off of like, that's where they feel the safest or the most tolerable, for maybe they have other symptoms that's limiting them from more ranges of motion? And then how do you determine, like, how do we move forward beyond that and go from there?
Yeah, for sure. So I find that most people, they're going to have a mobility limitation somewhere. Like you can push anyone too far, and everyone's going to have a load limitation. You can push everyone too heavy. And I find some people are more load limited than mobility limited, and vice versa. Some people can, I think, get, more novelty, more stimulus, focusing on one of those than the other, letting the other one come later. But I don't think that they're mutually exclusive either. I don't think you have to do one or the other. I don't think you have to say we're just going to train isometrically or we're just going to train, dynamically or whatever. I find having kind of a dual progression can often work really well for someone. So, for example, if it was someone that, they didn't have a great tolerance for some of these movements, if you try to do a weighted GHD sit up, they're like, nah, it hurts my back or whatever, and that's fine. What I find for someone like that is you probably don't have to say no to the position completely. Maybe we just start with a gentle like hold or mobilization or whatever you want to call it, just kind of get them into a gentle bend or flex position, or start exploring that position that's a little bit sensitive for them, and just work on some deep breathing. Just get them comfortable spending some time there in a way that doesn't hurt, that allows them to feel some confidence. If you have that on one side of their program, on the other side, you can say, okay, we have the low load stuff in some of the provocative positions. Now, how can we drive as much mechanical tension as possible in a position that does feel good? I find you can do both of those things simultaneously, and if you are able to do both of those things at once, I think that's going to be a superior option to only focusing on one or the other, which I think is a potential mistake when people, and this is generalizable to a lot of kind of rehab type situations, of some people only focus on what hurts, and they're like, okay, my knee hurts in this position, I'm going to do like low load isos and whatever, but it comes at the expense of actually training hard, doing all the things that they still can do hard. And likewise, other people, they'll be like, my knee hurts in this position, I'm going to stay away from that, and they just train hard doing all the things that they can do without pain, and they neglect some of those provocative positions. So I find in all cases it's generally best to kind of have that dual approach of, let's train hard where you can train hard, and let's also like scale some of the challenging things to an appropriate level. I'd say I kind of take like an 80-20 sort of approach there, of like 80% of someone's program should be just train hard in ways that feel good to you. 20% can be more, let's explore the things that freak you out a little bit, where you have a little bit of hesitation. Let's make it doable and come up with a way to kind of start getting that back into the 80%, the meat and potatoes of your program. So from a core perspective, I find everyone can load their core heavy in some capacity, whatever that looks like for them, whether that's an isometric hold, a plank, a pull-off hold, starting to introduce some small perturbations. For example, like I see people doing the pull-off where they like write their name or something with their hands. You can make all that stuff hard. So I want to see someone doing something that's hard to them. And then also, like, let's explore some of those things that give you a little bit more hesitation and just start building some confidence.
I have two follow-up questions that are not really related, but one, I think it was in that same video with Eugene, of some of these flexion-based activities. You are utilizing maybe not even a ton of weight, but just like the lever change in just the arms, like with decline sit-ups or these GHR positions, where it's shocking how much harder a movement can be just where you place your arms. Can you touch on that and how beneficial that can be for maybe someone who's doing these activities with less available equipment or less options, and like just using like the position of your body can really dictate how hard it is?
Yeah, so there's two things here. One's slightly off topic, but I'll throw it in and then I'll get to that. I generally find that one of the things that makes people hesitant with core work, if they are someone that likes to lift heavy, so if they're someone that likes to squat, deadlift, etc., they're like, I know the axial load isn't bad, but it is something to be managed in a program, and I don't want to overdo it. If you start adding in some of these, like, I've done, like body weight side bends, like side bends with 200 pounds in one hand kind of thing. I can see why someone wouldn't want to do that and then try to deadlift. And it's like, that's just so much axial fatigue in one day. It's definitely possible to overdo it. So a lot of these variations that you mentioned, some of the things I like about some of the body weight variations is there are ways to challenge your core in each of these planes of motion without having that axial fatigue component. So if you are someone that either one, that's, kind of provocative to you, that compression doesn't feel very good, or two, you're just someone who's like, I already have a ton of axial load in my program, I don't want to double down and I'm worried about how much I can handle. Some of these exercises where instead of, for a side bend, for example, instead of holding 200 pounds in one of my hands, if I just hold a 25-pound plate over my head in side bend, just using that longer lever of the arms being extended and overhead, I can make a 25-pound side bend extremely hard, just as hard as a 200-pound side bend, just by changing the placement of the load. And for someone who is worried about some of the compression, I find some of those options are a little bit more tolerable. And I've generally found people have more success, getting into some of those lower absolute load core movements, with just a little bit more success than some of the ones that are a little bit more compressive, at least initially. Again, I don't think that the compressive load is inherently bad. It's just something to be managed, but it can make some of those movements a little bit more accessible to ask yourself, how can I make this more challenging without needing to add more weight to it? Just change the leverage, change the position. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Even I think you showed in that video, like almost like an eccentric overload with a decline sit up where the arms are straight overhead as you kind of descend, and then you kind of bring it closer to the body or behind the back, with the hands clasping the head, to come back up to the concentric. So you just have this like pretty intense overload stimulus in the eccentric portion that you don't really need to adjust the weight. It's just the arm position, which is great.
Yeah, I wouldn't jump right into eccentric overload right away, but definitely a fun variation to explore later on.
Yeah, totally. I think the second follow-up or second other question I had is, especially with these rotational activities, I think you've done a really good job finding ways to anchor your body to actually get progressive loading. Can you touch on ways you've explored and found options to make an exercise harder in this rotational component where it's really easy to get off balance?
Yeah. So I mentioned like the pull-off press earlier in this conversation, and I think it does have a place for someone who's just beginning to introduce some of these patterns. But I kind of pick on the exercise a little bit too, because I generally find that for most people, if you try to progress it long term, it's actually going to be just your ability to stay on the ground that becomes like your limiting factor of, whether you're holding a band or a cable, you're just going to get pulled off the ground into the cable stack or whatever. Or like you're going to have a failure at the hip of like being able to maintain that hip position. You're just going to kind of break down there. So a lot of exercises that people think are core exercises, well, there's definitely some core load. I find more often than not, there's going to be some sort of limitation at the arms or the hips, or just general like external stability and support to stay on the ground. A lot of those things are going to break down long before your core does. And so generally, I think people they have this feeling that, like they'll be doing a pull-off press type exercise, and I think people compensate for these issues just by making it longer, and like they just add reps. And I think that's part of what leads to some of the like really high rep approaches to this kind of stuff, is like just increased loading doesn't always feel practical. You try to do a really heavy pull off press and you're like, it just doesn't feel right, you know? And so I think people experience that. They're like, this doesn't feel right. And so they think that maybe, you're just not supposed to load it heavy, or that's the problem, where it's really just a consequence of the setup. So for a lot of these exercises, especially rotation, I find is most prone to this, of just having something to support your hips, so that you don't get either pulled off the ground or your hips don't twist, to really be able to separate hip movement from torso movement, get that hip shoulder separation as well. Having some sensory feedback there can be really great too. So kind of two components to it. One, just keep yourself on the ground, have a box, a weight belt as an anchor, like something to just push on your hips into the ground or away from the cable stack. And then two, having that feedback. If you look at like the classic rotary torso machine, that I think people sleep on that machine too much. I think it's great. One of the great things about that machine is it's idiot proof. You can't really mess it up. You can't start, like I see people trying to do cable rotations and like they're just moving their arms and not their torso, or they do like a cable chop and instead of actually rotating the torso, they turn the whole body. There's all these sorts of faults that can potentially come into these rotational movements, where you put someone on like a rotary torso machine and there's really nothing you can do wrong because it's so stable, it's so fixed. And when we think of like a constraints led approach of make the desired action, the only available action of like, this is what I want you to do, and you have to do it right the way it's set up. The more constraints and sensory feedback we can provide for someone, the more likely they are to kind of move in the way that we want them to move. And later on, if you want to have something that's a little bit more, athletic or have a greater, coordination demand to it, I find people are going to be a lot more successful there if they've had kind of a foundation built with some of these more stable options.
Something else I've noticed with some of the side bending work is there's like sneaky amount of adductor and like groin loading in some of those, because you're bringing up one of the limbs into like a supported like long lever outstretched position, whether it's on a bench or on a box, and you're going into the side bend, and it's like great from a lateral flexion perspective, but also from like loading the adductors. Can you kind of discuss, or maybe like allude to like why you do that and why it's beneficial?
Yeah, so when we think of, what does rotation look like in sport, what does lateral flexion look like in sport, obviously it's not very common that you see some of these movements completely isolated as we do in the gym. You can say the same thing about, a bicep curl and stuff too. I don't think that the lack of isolation in the real world means we shouldn't isolate in the gym. I think there's definitely value in being able to train some of these things individually. But thinking about, what does this generally pair with in some, real world sporting athletic activities and whatnot is also a potentially helpful thing to think about. And it's rare in kind of sport to see, the obliques, for example, it's rare to see them kind of do anything without working alongside the hips. If you're swinging a baseball bat, if you're throwing a ball, anything like that, where you're getting that, the rotation of the torso, you're generally going to get rotation at the hips first, and you get the hips kind of leading in front to create a pre-stretch, essentially, to get that eccentric loading on the core, and then follow through with the twist the obliques. That's generally what you see in any sort of high velocity type situation, right? So I do think it's helpful to make sure that we've addressed kind of all parts of that chain. I don't think we always have to do it in a way that mimics sport. I don't think we need to get, down the functional rabbit hole too deep, but it is good to be aware of like what muscles are being trained, in some of these patterns in the real world, and make sure we've addressed some of that. So, you look at like a Copenhagen plank, you got the adductor on one leg and the contralateral obliques. It's great to see some of that kind of stuff in a program too.
Anything else you feel like we haven't touched on with ab training that you want to touch on, or just these things that you commonly see performed on social media or you've heard from clients where you just want to kind of elaborate on it?
Yeah. I would say that a lot of exercises that, you're going to feel your abs, sensation is not always a reliable indicator of stimulus. And I think people often go chasing sensation with the abs. We talked about earlier, the high rep, kind of mistakes that people make. But even when it does come to heavier stuff, I think that people make that mistake of chasing sensation, where when you get into some of these positions that you're loading more of a stretch position, they're going to feel challenging, but you're not generally going to get the burn that you get from doing 100 crunches, and that's okay. You definitely are going to get more sensation from a lot of isometric stuff. If you do a suitcase carry, for example, not saying that they're inherently good or bad, but like that's going to drive a lot of sensation. That doesn't automatically mean that it's better than, a full range of motion side bend that you might actually reach failure after 10 reps before there's been a lot of burning. They can both be valid options. Just don't make the mistake of thinking more sensation is always better.
Anything else?
That's all I got.
Perfect. Well, I think 40 minutes of talking about abs is enough. And I think it's great. And some of this is hard to like visualize. So I'm going to link that video I thought was awesome with Eugene, and then your YouTube. You just have really good short kind of clips of you performing these exercises, and then your social media. And then, personally, I've loved the Thick and Quick program, and I know you have Sex and Zombies. So yeah, if anyone actually wants to like see how Alec programs, buying the program and doing it is great. So we'll call it there. Alec, we appreciate you coming on for round 2. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Until round 3.
That's right.